I never thought inheriting my grandfather's 80-acre farm would change my life so dramatically. In fact, when I first got the news, I saw it as just another responsibility to juggle alongside my engagement to Ashley and my duties in the National Guard. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It was a warm spring evening when everything started to unravel. Ashley and I were heading out for our usual Friday movie date when she dropped the bomb. Jack, you know I'm leaving right after graduation, right? I turned to look at her, confused. What do you mean leaving? Me, Brittany, and Madison have everything planned, she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. We're going on a cross-country road trip. The whole summer, just exploring the West, living our best lives. My stomach dropped. We had talked about getting married after her graduation, settling down, maybe even starting our life together on the farm. Ashley, we agreed you'd drop this crazy idea when we decided to get married, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What changed? She rolled her eyes, a gesture that had become increasingly common lately. Oh, Jack, I never agreed to that. We've been planning this trip since freshman year, but we need some cash for traveling expenses, she continued, twirling her hair around her finger. We've saved every penny, but we might need to find someone to help cover additional costs. Something in her tone made my skin crawl. Help cover costs? I repeated slowly. What exactly does that mean? She shrugged, avoiding my eyes. You know how it is. Sometimes you meet generous people who want to help out pretty young travelers. My blood began to boil. I'd seen how her friends Brittany and Madison behaved when they were away from home. I'd witnessed their drunken escapades during girls' nights out, seen the way they flirted with any man who might buy them drinks. Ashley, if you go on this trip, we're done, I said firmly. I won't sit at home while my fiancée parties her way across the country with those two. She turned to me, her eyes flashing with anger. Those are my best friends you're talking about, and I'm supposed to be your future husband, I shot back. What's different about your weekend training trips with the Guard? She challenged. You know damn well what's different. I'm a soldier. I go for training and active duty when called. It's my job. The rest of the evening was a blur. We went to the movie as planned, but I couldn't tell you what we watched. My mind was too busy replaying all the little warning signs I'd ignored over the past year. The subtle disdain in her voice when she talked about our future on the farm. The way she dismissed my military service as just another job. The countless times she'd chosen her friends over our plans. I drove her home in silence after the movie. When we reached her apartment, I walked her to the door. Tea of habit. Aren't you coming in? She asked, her voice sultry, trying to smooth things over the way she always did. No, Ashley. Not tonight. Not until you decide what you really want. As I turned to leave, she called after me. Jack, you didn't even kiss me goodnight. Why are you being like this? I looked back at her over the roof of my old pickup. Because I finally see things clearly, I replied. If you go on that trip, we're done. And I mean done. I drove away, leaving her standing there in her doorway. Through my rearview mirror, I could see her two friends appear behind her, their faces lit with knowing smirks. That was the last time I saw Ashley, or so I thought at the time. The next morning, I packed up my small apartment and moved to the farm. The property wasn't much to look at. Just 80 acres of mostly uncultivated land, a dilapidated machine shed, and an interesting natural feature, a cave set into a limestone bluff overlooking a creek. My grandfather used to tell me stories about that cave, how the local Native Americans had used it for shelter, how early settlers had stored their harvests there, how he'd played in it as a boy. Now it would become my home. I spent the next few weeks turning the cave into a livable space. It wasn't exactly the American dream, but there was something satisfying about working with my hands, making something out of nothing. I installed basic plumbing, ran electricity from the machine shed, and built a small kitchen area. The cave stayed cool in summer and retained heat well in winter. With some concrete blocks and careful stonework, I constructed a front wall with windows and a sturdy door. My neighbors thought I was crazy, all except Dan Jefferson, the old farmer next door. He took me under his wing, teaching me modern farming techniques I'd never learned in my construction management classes. Most folks don't plow anymore, he explained one day, watching me struggle with my grandfather's old equipment. We spray to kill the weeds, then plant right into the ground. Saves time and money, plus it's better for the soil. Dan loaned me his no-till planter and showed me how to use it. Under his guidance, I planted my first crop of soybeans. Life fell into a rhythm. During the day, I worked on the farm or did my guard duties. At night, I sat on my newly built porch, watching the sunset paint the limestone cliffs golden. Sometimes I thought about Ashley, wondering what she was doing. But those thoughts came less and less frequently as the weeks passed. I was starting to realize that maybe our breakup wasn't the disaster I'd initially thought it was. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late June, hot enough that the air shimmered above the fields. I was working on extending my porch when I heard the distant rumble of a tractor. Looking up, I saw someone mowing hay in the field across the creek. I'd never seen this Pardic, Euler tractor operator before and wondered if Dan had hired help for the season. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself stealing glances at the methodical back-and-forth progress across the field. The tractor finally stopped at the creek's edge, directly across from where I was working. The operator climbed down, and I nearly dropped my hammer. It was a woman, and not just any woman. She moved with a slight limp, but there was a grace to her movements that caught my eye. She had short dark hair and an athletic build that spoke of military training. Without seeming to notice me, she pulled off her work shirt, revealing a swimsuit underneath. She eased into the creek, sighing with relief as the cool water enveloped her. I tried to focus on my work, to give her privacy, but I couldn't help stealing glances. There was something compelling about her, something that went beyond mere physical attraction. Finally, she noticed me. Instead of being embarrassed or angry at my presence, she smiled and waved. "Hope you don't mind sharing your swimming hole," she called out. "The creek belongs to everyone." I called back, grateful for an excuse to properly look at her. "I'm Emma Morgan. I help my parents run the farm across the way." "Jack Thompson," I replied. "I inherited this place from my grandfather." "Oh, the cave guy." She grinned. "Dad told me someone was turning the old cave into a house. Thought he was pulling my leg." She pulled herself up onto a rock, water streaming from her hair. "Want to show me what you've done with the place?" And just like that, my solitary existence shifted into something new, something that felt a lot like possibility. Emma became a regular visitor after that first meeting. She'd finish her farm work, then cool off in the creek before joining me for a beer on my porch. I learned she'd been a combat medic in the Army until an IED changed her plans. "Got a little banged up on a mission," she explained one evening, absently rubbing her scarred leg. "They patched me up, but I couldn't meet the physical requirements anymore." "Must have been tough," I said, thinking of my own guard service. She shrugged, taking a sip of her beer. "The hardest part was losing my sense of purpose. I went from saving lives to feeling useless." "You're not useless," I protested. "I've seen you run that tractor better than most men I know." That made her laugh, a sound I'd grown to look forward to. "Yeah, well, farming's different. No one shoots at you while you're baling hay." We fell into an easy friendship. She taught me tricks for maintaining my equipment that I'd never have figured out on my own. I helped her with heavy lifting tasks that her injury made difficult. Sometimes we'd just sit in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies dance over the creek. One evening, she caught me staring at her old Army photo. "Looking for signs of the person I used to be?" she asked quietly. "No," I replied, Nestle, just thinking how much stronger you are now." She looked at me sharply, disbelief clear in her eyes. "Stronger? I can barely walk some days." "Physical strength isn't everything, Emma. You got knocked down and got back up. That's real strength. She didn't respond, but I saw her blink back tears. After that night, something shifted between us. Our conversations grew deeper, more personal. She told me about the mission that ended her military career. I shared my fears about my upcoming deployment. We talked about our dreams, our disappointments, our hopes for the future. I found myself looking forward to her visits more than I cared to admit. The way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. How she'd absently run her fingers through her short hair when she was thinking. The determined set of her jaw when she tackled a difficult task. Then came the day of the storm. The morning started normally enough. Emma arrived early to help me repair some fencing. But by afternoon, the air had turned heavy and still. The kind of stillness that makes farmers nervous. We were sitting on my porch, taking a water break, when the wind began to pick up. Dark clouds rolled in from the southwest, moving faster than any weather I'd ever seen. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the wind shifted. That's when we heard it, a sound like a freight train bearing down on us. Emma's eyes met mine, wide with recognition. "Tornado," we said in unison. I grabbed her hand and pulled her inside, just as the first debris started flying. The wind howled, seeming to come from all directions at once. We made it to my storage room at the back of the cave, just as we heard glass breaking in the main room. I held Emma close in the darkness, feeling her trembling against me. Whether from fear or adrenaline, I couldn't tell. The roar grew louder, and the whole world seemed to shake. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went quiet. Too quiet. We waited a few more minutes, just to be sure. When we finally emerged, the devastation took our breath away. My porch roof was gone. One of the front windows was shattered. The machine shed looked like a giant had stepped on it. But Emma wasn't looking at any of that. Her eyes were fixed across the creek, where her family's farm stood, or what was left of it. "Mom and Dad," she whispered, already moving toward the door. "We have to get to them." I grabbed my chainsaw and some basic tools, knowing we'd likely need them. The next few hours would test us all in ways we never expected. But in that moment, watching Emma's determined stride despite her limp, I realized something important. I wasn't just helping my neighbor anymore. I was following the woman I was falling in love with into the teeth of a storm. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Getting to Emma's parents' house was like navigating through a war zone. We had to stop every few hundred yards to clear fallen trees from the road. My old pickup truck crawled along at a snail's pace, its headlights cutting through the dust-filled air. Emma sat tensely beside me, her hands clenched in her lap. "They'll be okay," I kept saying, though I had no way to know for sure. "Dad always said if a storm came, they'd go to the basement," she replied, her voice tight with worry. When we finally reached their property, my heart sank. The farmhouse was barely recognizable. The roof had partially collapsed, and debris was scattered everywhere. Emma was out of the truck before I could fully stop, limping as fast as she could toward the house. "Mom, Dad," she called out, her voice breaking. Then we heard it, a muffled response from beneath the rubble. "We're down here. The basement door is stuck." I've never seen someone move as fast as Emma did then, injury and all. We found the basement doors partially blocked by debris. Working together, we cleared enough space to pry them open. There, huddled in the corner, but mercifully unharmed, were Emma's parents. Her mother, Sarah, was crying as she hugged Emma. Her father, Robert, looked shaken but relieved. "The house," he said, looking up at what remained of their home. "Everything we built. We can rebuild," Emma said firmly. "What matters is you're both safe." I clear my throat. "You should all stay at my place until we figure things out." Robert started to protest, but Sarah cut him off. "Thank you, Jack. We'd appreciate that." The next few days were a blur of activity. We salvaged what we could from both properties. The community rallied around us, bringing food, supplies, and helping hands. That's the thing about small farming communities. When disaster strikes, everyone becomes family. Emma and her parents settled into my cave house. It was cramped, but we made it work. Robert and I took the main room, while Emma and Sarah had the bedroom. During the day, we worked on repairs. At night, we sat around my small table, planning our next steps. That's when I got the call. My guard unit was being deployed to Iraq. 1 year minimum. I broke the news over dinner. The silence that followed was deafening. When? Emma finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. 2 weeks, I replied, unable to meet her eyes. But the repairs, Robert began. I'll help as much as I can before I go, I promised. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on what remained of my porch, staring at the stars. I heard Emma's uneven footsteps before I saw her. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, sitting beside me. Keep thinking about everything that needs to be done. She was quiet for a moment. We'll handle it, she said finally. Mom, Dad, and I will take care of both farms while you're gone. Emma, I can't ask you to dash. You're not asking. I'm telling. She turned to face me, her expression fierce in the moonlight. You've given us a home when we needed it most. Let us return the favor. Besid. Yes, she added, a slight smile playing at her lips. Someone needs to make sure you have something worth coming back to. I reached for her hand in the darkness. She intertwined her fingers with mine. We sat there in comfortable silence, both aware that something had changed between us. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind. I added Emma to my bank account so she could handle expenses while I was gone. We made lists of repairs, discussed crop rotations, planned for every contingency we could think of. But we didn't talk about us, about what this thing growing between us meant. The morning I had to leave, Emma drove me to the base. We were both quiet during the drive. When she pulled up to the deployment center, I turned to say goodbye. But before I could speak, she leaned over and kissed me. It wasn't a dramatic movie kiss, just a soft, sweet meeting of lips that held more promise than passion. Don't you dare get yourself killed, she whispered against my mouth. I've got plans for you when you get back. I touched my forehead to hers. Yes, ma'am. As I walked toward the building, I looked back one last time. Emma stood by my truck, her hand raised in farewell. The morning sun caught her hair, making it glow like a halo. That's how I would remember her during the long months ahead. My guardian angel in work boots and overalls. The desert heat hit me like a physical wall when we landed in Iraq. But it wasn't the temperature that made me catch my breath. It was the sudden, stark realization that I was leaving behind so much more than just a farm this time. I was leaving behind possibility, leaving behind hope, leaving behind love. And all I could do was pray I'd make it back to claim them. The days in Iraq blurred together in a haze of dust, sweat, and endless missions. As a combat engineer, I spent most of my time either building or blowing things up. We constructed schools one day and cleared IEDs the next. The temperature often hit 130 degrees, hot enough to fry an egg on our vehicles. But every night, before exhaustion claimed me, I wrote to Emma. Sometimes just a few lines, sometimes pages. I told her about the stars in the desert sky, so different from our view back home. About the local kids who would wave as our convoy passed. About the small victories and daily frustrations of military life. Her letters back were my lifeline. She wrote about the progress on both farms, how the community had come together to help rebuild, how she'd used my insurance money wisely, stretching every dollar. Your soybeans are growing beautifully, she wrote. Dad says you're a natural farmer. Each letter smelled faintly of hay and sunshine. I kept them all, worn and creased from repeated reading. 3 months into the deployment, everything changed. We were working on a mountain road when the attack came. The first RPG took out our lead vehicle. The second missed, but the explosion showered us with rocks and debris. My platoon sergeant went down in the initial burst of gunfire. Suddenly, I found myself in command of 20 soldiers caught in a kill zone. Time seemed to slow down. Training kicked in. I ordered our gunners to provide covering fire while I led a flanking maneuver. The firefight lasted maybe 30 minutes. It felt like hours. When it was over, we had no casualties beyond the initial wounds. The attackers had fled, leaving their weapons behind. My commander put me in for a Bronze Star. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt grateful to be alive. That night, I wrote the longest letter I'd ever written to Emma. Not about the battle. I couldn't bring myself to worry her with that. Instead, I wrote about my feelings for her. How she'd changed my life. How thoughts of her kept me going. How I couldn't wait to come home and tell her in person. Her response came 2 weeks later. "You better keep your word about coming home," she wrote, "because I've got a surprise waiting for you." She included a photo of my farm. I barely recognized it. The cave house had been completely finished, with a wraparound porch and proper stone walls. The machine shed was rebuilt, bigger than before. Gardens bloomed where there had once been bare earth. "Your grandfather would be proud," she wrote, "and I hope you will be too." I stared at that photo for hours. It represented more than just repairs and improvements. It was a promise, a future. Time moved differently after that. Every mission, every patrol brought me one step closer to home, to Emma. Then came the letter I never expected. "Ashley came by the farm looking for you," Emma wrote. "She's pregnant, Jack. Says she wants to make things right. I told her you were deployed. She seemed desperate. I think you should know she's been asking around town about you." My hands shook as I read those words, but not from fear or regret, from certainty. Because in that moment, reading about my ex-fiancée's return, I felt nothing. No jealousy, no longing, no what-ifs. Instead, I found myself smiling, thinking about Emma standing up to Ashley, protecting our future, our love. I wrote back immediately. "The only thing waiting for me at home that matters is you." As my deployment neared its end, the letters flew back and forth more frequently. Emma told me about the last of the repairs, about her plans for both farms, about how she'd learned to drive my old tractor. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, we got our departure date. One more week in the desert. One more week until I could hold her again. One more week until I could start the life I'd been dreaming of. The life I never knew I wanted until a beautiful woman with a slight limp decided to go swimming in my creek. What I didn't know then was that coming home would bring its own challenges, its own battles. But this time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. The military does. It's best to prepare you for combat. But nobody prepares you for coming home, for how overwhelming normal things can feel after a year in a war zone. I felt at the moment our plane touched down on American soil. The colors seemed too bright, the air too clean, the crowds too loud. Then I saw her. Emma was standing with her parents near the arrival gate. She'd let her hair grow out a little while I was gone. It framed her face in soft waves that caught the morning light. When our eyes met, everything else faded away. I dropped my bags and ran to her. She met me halfway, her limp forgotten in her excitement. We crashed together like waves meeting the shore. "You're really here," she whispered against my neck. I held her tighter, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and sunshine. "I'm home." Her parents gave us a moment before stepping forward for their own hugs. Sarah was crying, and even Robert looked misty-eyed. "Welcome home, son," he said, clapping me on the back. The drive home was surreal. Emma insisted on taking me to my favorite pizza place in town first. "You wrote about craving it in every other letter," she teased. I figured we'd better handle that before anything else. The house of pizza looked exactly as I remembered. Red checkered tablecloths, the old jukebox in the corner, the smell of oregano and fresh bread in the air. We had just settled into our booth when I heard a familiar voice. "Jack? Oh my God, Jack." My stomach dropped. I looked up to see Ashley standing there in a waitress uniform. Her pregnancy was obvious now. She was staring at me like she'd seen a ghost. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Before I could respond, she leaned down to hug me. I jerked back instinctively. "Hello, Ashley," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Emma sat up straighter beside me, her hand finding mine under the table. Ashley's eyes narrowed as she noticed our joined hands. "So this is why you wouldn't see me?" she spat. "You've been fooling around with some crippled farm girl." The restaurant went quiet. I started to stand, anger burning in my chest. But Emma squeezed my hand, holding me in place. She looked up at Ashley with calm confidence. "Actually," Emma said smoothly, "he's been serving our country in Iraq. And this crippled farm girl got her injuries serving too. But you wouldn't know anything about service or sacrifice, would you, Ashley?" Ashley's face flushed red. "You don't know anything about me," she hissed. "I know enough," Emma replied. "I know you chose a summer of partying over the good man who loved you. I know you're only interested in him now because you need someone to save you. But here's the thing, Ashley. He's not available for saving anymore. He's with someone who never needed saving in the first place." Ashley burst into tears and ran toward the kitchen. "Maybe we should go somewhere else," I suggest. "Ed." Emma shook her head. "No way. I've been dreaming about their garlic knots for months. Besides," she added with a wink, "I'm not letting her chase us away from your homecoming meal." That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was going to marry this woman. We got our pizza from a different waitress who kept shooting us sympathetic looks. It tasted just as good as I remembered. But the best part was watching Emma across the table. The way she laughed at my jokes. The way she stole my pepperoni when she thought I wasn't looking. The way she made everything feel right in my world. After lunch, we finally headed to the farm. As we turned onto the gravel road, I held my breath. The photos hadn't done it justice. My grandfather's old farm had been transformed. The cave house looked like something out of a magazine. Natural stone walls blended seamlessly with the cliff face. The wraparound porch provided the perfect spot for watching sunsets. The machine shed gleamed with new metal siding. Fresh gravel lined the driveway. Gardens bursting with vegetables and flowers surrounded the house. "Do you like it?" Emma asked nervously. "Like it?" I couldn't find the words. Instead, I pulled her close and kissed her. Really kissed her, the way I had been wanting to since I first saw her at the airport. When we finally came up for air, she was smiling. "I'll take that as a yes." She led me inside, showing me all the improvements. The kitchen with its new appliances. The living room with comfortable furniture. The bedroom with a handmade quilt on the bed. "Your mom made that," she explained. "Said every home needs a proper quilt." "It's perfect," I said. "All of it." She turned to face me, suddenly serious. "I know it might seem like a lot, using your insurance money and savings this way. But I wanted you to have something to come home to. Something worthy of all you've done." I cupped her face in my hands. "Emma, having you to come home to was already more than I deserved. Everything else is just icing on the cake." She leaned into my touch. "So you're not mad about the money?" I laughed. "Mad? Honey, you've turned my grandfather's old farm into paradise. Speaking of which," I added, "how did you manage all this on the insurance money?" Her eyes twinkled. "Let's just say being the local hero's girl has its advantages. Everyone wanted to help. Suppliers gave us discounts. Neighbors volunteered their time and equipment. Your service meant something to them, Jack. You mean something to this community." I looked around at my transformed home, at this amazing woman who had made it all possible. And I knew it was time. I reached into my pocket, fingers closing around the small box I'd been carrying since Iraq. "Emma," I said softly, "there's something I need to ask you." Emma's eyes widened as I dropped to one knee. Despite my bad timing, despite my dusty uniform, despite everything, this moment felt perfect. I had this whole speech planned, I admitted. about how you rebuilt not just my farm, but my life, about how you gave me something to fight for, to come home to. My hands were shaking as I opened the small velvet box. But standing here now, looking at everything you've done, everything you are, I only need to say one thing. Emma Morgan, will you marry me? She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Then she smiled, that brilliant, beautiful smile that had first captured my heart by the creek. Yes, she whispered. Yes, yes, yes. She pulled me to my feet and into her arms. The ring, a simple diamond set in my grandmother's band, fit perfectly. Later that evening, we sat on our porch, watching the sunset. Her parents had come over with champagne to celebrate. The four of us talked and laughed as fireflies began to dance over the creek. This was what coming home really meant. Not just returning to a place, but to people who love you. The years that followed proved that love can build something stronger than any storm. We married that fall, under the old oak tree by the creek. Emma wore wildflowers in her hair. I wore my dress uniform. The whole community turned out to celebrate. Even Ashley came, her baby daughter in her arms. She seemed happier now, more settled. Sometimes life has a way of putting everyone exactly where they need to be. We took over both farms, combining them into one operation. Emma's parents moved into the cave house after we built our family home on the hill. Every morning, I wake up thankful for that tornado that destroyed my plans, for the deployment that showed me what really mattered, for the twist of fate that brought a beautiful woman to my creek on a hot summer day. Our children play in that same creek now. They climb the same limestone cliffs. They help us during harvest, learning the rhythms of farm life. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Emma and I sit on the porch of the cave house. We watch the sunset paint the limestone golden. Her head rests on my shoulder, just like it did that first year. Her limp is a little more pronounced these days. My hair has started to gray. But when she looks at me, I still see that fierce army medic who wasn't afraid to take a chance on a broken-hearted farmer. Any regrets? She asked me recently. I pulled her closer, thinking about all we've built together. The farm's flourishing under our care. Our children growing strong and kind. The love that has only deepened with each passing season. Just one, I replied. She raised an eyebrow. I wish I'd met you sooner. She laughed and kissed me. Everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. Farmer boy. And you know what? She was right. Sometimes the best things in life come from broken plans, from storms that force us to rebuild, from letting go of what we thought we wanted, and holding on to what we never knew we needed. That's what I learned on this piece of land. That's what Emma taught me. That's the story I'll pass down to our children. About how their mother turned a cave into a home. About how she healed not just the land, but my heart. About how sometimes the worst storm can blow you right where you're meant to be, if you just have the courage to weather it, and the wisdom to recognize love when it finds you, even if it comes limping up to your swimming hole on a hot summer day. Especially then,